Welcome to Wave Wasters, I'm Matt, and today I'm going to continue on with the Otter bite build by creating the blank. In my last video, I went over a rough idea of where I'm taking this board as far as design elements and how I want it to surf. And I also created the outline as well as the rocker templates. So in this video, I'm going to take my paper rocker template and I'm going to attach it to something that I can use as a template for the hot wire cutter. And then I'm going to hot wire out my blank and glue it up. So the first thing for this is going to be attaching the paper to the wood. So let's jump into getting the templates made. To attach my template to this wood paneling, I'm going to use a little spray adhesive. And instead of wood paneling, you can use MDF or thin plywood works really well. Once I have this template glued down, I'm going to rough cut it out on the bandsaw, leaving a little space around the template. Once I have the rough template cut out, I'm going to glue that back down to the wood panel and I'm going to roughly cut it out again. Finally, I'm going to trim it as close as I can to the paper template. Depending on your skill and tools, you may want to not cut it exactly to the template so that you can sand it down to the exact shape later. With this cut out, I'm going to separate the templates and let the glue fully cure overnight. The next step is screwing the two templates together so that I can clean them up with the sander, and this will make sure that the holes in the template match on both sides. It's also going to make sure that when I sand the template to the exact shape, the two sides are the exact same. This also makes sure the holes in the templates match, which will make it easier to screw them into the foam blank evenly. Luckily, I was able to find a supplier of EPS blocks locally, and these are denser than the typical EPS you find at the hardware store. I like to buy my EPS blocks a foot wide, which makes it easier to cut out my blanks. It also allows me to glue in a wood stringer really easy if that's something I want to do for the board I'm working on. To attach my templates to the foam, I like to use screws. I find this works really well for holding the templates on. It does leave a small hole, but they get filled when I glue up the blank. Once I have the template attached on one side, I'm going to measure from the bottom of the block to the screws, and I'm going to use these measurements to attach the other template on the other side. I find this works really well for keeping everything fairly square. Cut the blank halves out, I'm using a hot wire cutter I made. I'm not going to go into how I made mine as there's lots of tutorials that show how to make a better one than what I'm using. When using the hot wire cutter, I find a constant speed works best, and it takes a little practice to know how much pressure to use. The biggest thing is keeping the wire tight to the template, and I find pulling the wire into the template slightly works really well. So if you're cutting from the top, pull the wire slightly down into the template, and if you're cutting from the bottom, pull the wire slightly up into the template. If the wire comes away from the template, it's okay. You can also go back and clean it up after. Now that I have half my blank cut out, I'm going to repeat this process and cut the other half of my blank out. With both halves of my blank cut out, I'm going to now epoxy them together. I'm not adding a wood stringer, as I find using epoxy to glue the two blanks creates enough strength that I haven't really needed to add a stringer. This may not work for everyone, but it's worked really well for me. I also find that the glassing schedule I'm using, it's fine to not have a wood stringer in the board. To glue these, I'm going to add my wood templates to the side of each half of the blank. This will help spread out the pressure from my clamps. Once I have them attached, I like to lightly rough up the edges with like a screw or a screwdriver. This allows the epoxy to grip to the foam a little better. However, the epoxy will fill in between the EPS beads slightly. Lastly, I'm going to spread out my epoxy on the edges to be glued and clamp the two halves together. Alright, now that the blank is glued up, I'm going to let the epoxy cure. And I've found that the epoxy glue joint has held up really well, and I haven't needed to add in a wood stringer. But I've only done boards up to 8 foot, so if you're doing something longer, you may want to add in a wood stringer, or depending on the glassing schedule you're using, you may want to add a stringer to it, but it's very easy to do. You can use the same technique. You just sandwich your piece of wood in between the two bits of foam. So the next step for this board is shaping it, and I'm going to save that for the next video, so be sure to tune into that, and I'll see you in the next one.